Hi, welcome to Actual Spinster. If you notice, the backgrounds that I am filming in getting messier and messier. That's because I'm like moving soon-ish, so it's just gonna be like that for a while, but also this has been my background for like ages too. Because like I didn't really want to, I just hated where I lived, so I don't really have enough space. But hopefully that will also change soon. So obviously normally I do, well, yeah, I guess like generally I do like monthly wrap-ups, but the reason I didn't do a wrap-up for June was because I only read one book, which is crazy for me, and kind of like does show you that I was having quite a bad and hard time. I still am, but I have managed to read a bit more, which does also make me feel better. Not just in the sense of like, oh, I read X number, but just like I love reading, and being able to read is like a big part of my like, so it's sort of like how I express myself through what I read, and then also just like generally it's nice to I just love reading, which you get, so anyway, so the book I managed to read fully in June was Wandering Souls by Cecile Pin, which quite a few people have read. I think like the past 2 months have been very like recent releases heavy for me, and also just like recent acquisitions, I guess. Wandering Souls is a kind of like family story. It's told with like different viewpoints, and it's sort of fundamentally about a family who try to migrate from Vietnam to the US, but various tragedies befall them, and the three siblings, or three of the siblings of the family, like three of the children, end up in Britain in Thatcher's like in 1980s London. Yeah, it's a pretty short book, but it does kind of cover quite a lot of ground. So you also get like snippets from the familial ghosts, or specifically I think the babyest brother. It was a little while ago since I read it, so the details aren't super in my mind, but then you also get kind of like snippets of like a writer trying to write a story about family history, Vietnam, also about like violence and immigration. Like the story itself is also about that too, and there's some really intense like sexual violence stuff in it, just like really horrible. And I do think that there is this sense of kind of like wandering that the book itself has, where we just kind of like see what happens. So that obviously feels quite accurate to both this idea of like these souls who, because they passed away and they couldn't be buried in their homeland, or I can't quite remember the kind of cultural practices around that, but like that meant that they were forced to wander until they did get put at rest properly. So there's that kind of thing, but then it's also like the homelessness of like migrating somewhere, and these like three children, one of whom is like the main character basically, who's the eldest. Yeah, and it's just very sad. I think, you know, it was a good book. I do feel like, you know, it should have been longer for including so many different things in, but I don't think it was ineffective, and you know, a pretty difficult story to read, but also like reflective of reality and like how difficult it is to be a refugee, and yeah, and just like the violence of borders and also of war, which is what is sort of what instigates the original move. So yeah, it was like such a sad book. I wouldn't, you know, say I like enjoyed it or anything, but like it was a good book. I thought it was like, yeah. I did also start reading this, I think in June. This is A Day at Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon, and I haven't finished this still, so I've been reading it for 2 months now, but I am on page basically like 700, and there's like 860 or something, so I'm in the home straight. I think I will talk about this now then. So obviously, like I said, I have read the majority of it so far, and I loved The Prairie of the Orange Tree. I think it's interesting in this book, some of the like issues with The Prairie of the Orange Tree especially were around like the ending for me, in terms of thinking of it as like a book that was made by someone, but you know, I still enjoyed it, blah blah blah, almost like maybe as a way to kind of like try to offset some of that criticism, or to like get better at writing pace, I guess, and also maybe endings, although obviously I haven't quite got there. This book is split into years, which I thought was kind of interesting. So there's 4 years in it, but I do also think that there are still some issues with the pace of the novel in a way that doesn't quite work. And I also just feel like Samantha Shannon was like, I wrote an 800-page book, which means any prequel to it has to also be 800 pages. So I will write 800 pages, but like I don't think it needs to be this long. It's not that I'm bored or anything, although I definitely feel like the lull, like the ebb and lull of my own interest in reading it and my enjoyment of parts over other parts. But I do just feel like, yeah, it's sort of like is making a point to be like a big fantasy book rather than like being a big fantasy book because, you know, you've got lots of things to say and the world is very intricate. I also think that like reading this, having read The Priory of the Orange Tree, I mean, I don't remember all of it, but I do feel like there's a couple things in it that like, because I read The Priory of the Orange Tree, like I know what happened in the future of the world this is set in. And as a result, when players who are relevant to that later world are in here, I'm like, well, okay, there's no suspense really for me about what's happening. I know about like which characters are kind of good or kind of bad. Rude. And I also feel like, unlike with The Priory of the Orange Tree, there were lots of characters in that and there were lots of characters in this. I feel like some of the characters are, like generally the characters are maybe better fleshed out in this, but at the same time, there is something very sort of like, I feel like this is mean to say, but like almost kind of juvenile about the whole thing, or like, can't think of the right word I was looking for, but anyway, the characters. With The Priory of the Orange Tree, I like loved one character, like she was my favourite, Iad. I loved her like so much, and there isn't a character in this who I feel the same way as I did about her, which also has made me like enjoy it a bit less. I mean, I feel like now I'm getting closer to the end of the book. I do have some favourites, just like, yeah, not quite as like out there. And I mean, I do think it's nice that there are like sort of older sapphic characters in this on multiple levels. I think that this book is kind of about aging, or it's like trying to be, and like again, I don't know how successful it is with that, but you know, yeah, I think it's just sort of a bit like, why does this exist? Because it's not that it's a bad book, but it's like, did the story need to be told? Like, did it? And I also think it's just highly ironic that a book that kind of sold itself as being this like big standalone fantasy book, when The Priory of the Orange Tree came out, ended up having a prequel. You know, it's just sort of like for the sake of having a prequel. You know, I really like the character Dumai. I think she's great. I like Tunivel, though I also think she's not written in a especially good way. I do like Glorian, and I also really like Wolf. I think he's really sweet. But yeah, it's okay. I also think it's doing this thing where it's like north, south, east, west, and that's how the chapters are differentiated, like it tells you where they are, which I don't think is a very successful way to do it either, because you're following characters who travel, and I guess it's maybe a way to like keep people aware of where they are in the world, but I don't know, it's not very convincing. I'm sure there was one more thing I wanted to say. Anyway, it's fine. Maybe the ending will really pull it together and I'll change my mind, but I sort of find that very doubtful. So the next book I finished was a 5-star book for me, so that's great. This is Siblings by Brigitte Reimann. Just thinking of like, I think I did make a mid-year book freakout tag, didn't I? And I talked about this in it, I think. So I also actually have made a video that I haven't posted yet, but will be coming out soon-ish, about novels and art, partially because of the 2 books that I read in quick succession, and also another book that I finished recently, this one. I also actually felt like maybe I should have waited to make the video until after I had, because I could have included it, but it's too late. Anyway, so this is a pretty short novel, translated from the German by Lucy Jones, set in East Germany, about a painter called Elizabeth, and her kind of like conflict, I guess, with one of her brothers, the sibling who's closest to her in age, Uli, about whether he should leave the German Democratic Republic because he isn't enjoying living there, and it's not that he is not sort of a socialist to some degree, although not like a capital S socialist. It's just that he is like really struggling with the conditions under which he's trying to work. And yeah, he's like struggling a lot with that. And Elizabeth is, yeah, this like painter, and she has like this real commitment and like almost like a generosity towards the German Democratic Republic, and she's definitely inspired by it, but you know, it's not that she wouldn't criticize it or anything, but just like, yeah, anyway, so it's sort of about that, and I just loved it. I thought the way that it's written is beautiful, so obviously also the translation is, I'm sure, great, although obviously I haven't read it in the original German. And yeah, so it was written by this writer from East Germany too, around the same time that the novel is set, so very interesting. That's pre when the Berlin Wall, well, the novel is set pre the Berlin Wall being erected, and obviously one of the reasons why it was is to stop exactly what is sort of like being discussed in this novel, people like defecting to the West. Yeah, I just really loved it. I really loved how it described life and described like attention and then art and also socialism and like sort of, yeah, like ethics and care. I just really enjoyed it. Yeah, I kind of wanted to read like a little bit that I just loved so much, but I don't know if I can find it. Yeah, there's these like discussions about art that I really liked in this. You know, when you're reading a good book and they write something that describes like a very specific moment and you really feel not only the moment in the book, but it reflects onto your life and you suddenly become like attuned to like your sensations in such a like beautiful and kind of like strange and like shocking way in a way, but like shocking in like a tender way. Anyway, I really like that. And so yeah, there's this page, yeah, because obviously also something that's interesting that is going on in this book is thinking about like art and being an artist as a kind of labor, and then contrasting that with like other laborers and then the experiences of people who were in East Germany working. Interesting stuff, in my opinion. Betsy, that's the main character. Uli said impatiently, "What's up? Why are you staring at me?" "I'm discovering the human eye," I stammered fatuously. "I sometimes wonder when we stop discovering things." "You foolish artists never stop," my brother said. "Perhaps none of us do if we aren't completely boring or stupid. Tomorrow you'll discover mouths and next year shadows or a chiaroscuro that someone else spotted at least 500 years ago." He wasn't laughing at me like others did, when, suddenly overcome, I discovered a blank spot on the map of my mind and filled it with images. To me, moments like these were nothing short of a sensation. My friends laughed. "People knew that 100 years ago, silly." But my brother understood why these moments were sensational, and that right then I really owned what I'd learned from books, in lectures, and through observation. Okay, so then the next book I read was another art book, Your Love Is Not Good by Joanna Hedver, which was, yeah, interesting. It has a kind of crisis of art, of artistic meaning in it, which is interesting and also kind of like reflected in the chapter titles, which are like techniques and things relating to art. So this is icon, a sacred symbol, image, picture, or representation. And there's more kind of technical painting ones too. Let's see if I can find a better one. Alla prima, a painting technique in which a canvas is completed in one session, often having a thickly applied impasto applied in layers, also known as wet on wet. But then what happens is, as the book goes on, we get either like edited or completely wrong definitions, which are literally different from the original ones we've had. So this says capriccio, the cast of pictures representing inanimate objects, which I think is actually still life. But the book itself is about this artist who is a Korean American artist who is queer, and she basically takes a white woman as her muse for a new collection of paintings. And it's kind of about the consequences / fallout of that. It's very much about race and power in the art world. It's also about meaning, and yeah, it's just kind of an exploration of those things. Class too, and then it is also very sort of interested in desire and also kind of like ambition in a way, which I think is interesting. And the white woman who she develops a kind of relationship with, painting her, and then also becoming very successful out of that, is quite like fraught and yeah, sort of interesting in that respect too. One thing I felt was sad, that I wanted it to explore, was thinness alongside race and obviously specifically sort of whiteness in this context, because I felt like that's such like an unspoken aspect of beauty, power, and then also like you know, making paintings or like visual work that people want to buy and think are like beautiful or interesting objects. It's mostly that like the people in them are thin, and it frustrated me that that wasn't discussed, because it is very explicit about like racial power dynamics and class, and like obviously those two things are not separate from each other, they're intimately interconnected, and also about gender and yeah, like sexuality. But then it just like didn't really want to talk about the fact that like this white woman was obviously thin, which was like a major thing that was part of her work too. And yeah, that, I don't know, that made me kind of sad. And because it's not to say that I think that like if she had been fat it would have totally changed the racial dynamics, but it would have changed something, especially around like aesthetics and desirability, which would have been very interesting to kind of read about. Or at least if it had all stayed the same and the white model was thin like she was, but they had like talked about the fact that she was thin more so than just like a describing her as like a matter of course, then I think it could have got even deeper. But yeah, I think, you know, it was fun, and I always like Joanna Hedvert's work. I think that they're great. So okay, and then the last book I read was this Insurrecto by Gina Apostol, and I love this a lot as well. So I'm happy that I finally sort of read, you know, two of my favourites so far this year, definitely. This book might become one of my favourites, I don't know. So this is a really fun novel. It's sort of like yeah, it's like very playful in quite like a serious way, and in I guess maybe like kind of like an intellectual way, maybe to some degree, but it's also just playful. And it is about a translator who is like sort of hired by this like American filmmaker who wants to make a film about this massacre that happened in a place in the Philippines in 1901 during the like American-Philippine War, in a place called Balangiga, Samar. So the translator who's hired, she's a Filipina translator, and she's also kind of like returned to the Philippines in a way where the filmmaker also has kind of returned, because her dad was a famous filmmaker who made this like cult classic film called The Unintended, which was about the Vietnam War, but it was filmed in the Philippines. And then yeah, there are these theories that that film is actually not about the Vietnam War, it's about the massacre of Samar in 1901. Yeah, I would say we get kind of like 3 layers, because we kind of also sort of get a glimpse into the making of The Unintended in a way, and then we also get kind of like a more direct account, again in a way, of what was happening in 1901 in Balangiga, and then we also get the like more modern tale of Magdalene and Chiara, who's the filmmaker, making the film, or like potentially doing stuff related to making the film. Yeah, so there's like a lot going on, and it is very much about film and about scripts. It's also about grief in a way that I thought was like just very like beautiful, and was like an aspect that I wasn't prepared for, but like made it a richer and more meaningful reading experience. It's obviously about like very intense like imperial violence, but it does that in a way that doesn't feel like especially gratuitous. It's sort of interesting like that. I mean, maybe that's not entirely true, but it is also really thinking about representations of violence and how, I don't know, sort of like those like history begets history, but then there's just like a lot of doubling going on. So in that way it also feels kind of playful, because like the mirrors you hold up show not what you expected. Yeah, I don't know. And then within the different stories there's all sorts of kind of like mimetic stuff going on too, and like all sorts of parallels. But yeah, and so it's also kind of like a mystery. It is very like meta about itself, less so about it being a novel, but more so about it being created by a person, because there's like lots of references about like scripts and things, and like being part of the script, or like translating the script as you're part of the film and things like that. Sorry, I was losing light, and now I hope that's not too bad of a difference. Yeah, but anyway, I just really love this, and I definitely think if you're interested in the same things as I am, which is like, oh, and there's another thing, is I like how this had like such a sort of global centre to it, even as it's like specific. I thought it was done really well, and I also kind of like really enjoyed being like decentered from my own experience of like being in the world. I feel like I was gonna say something else. Yeah, I do think that like, yeah, if you like stuff that I like around like translation and art, and also history and its like legacy into the present and that kind of thing, then you would also enjoy this. And also grief. I obviously do like love grief books, I guess, if they're well done. Yeah, and I'm also sure there's lots of things that I missed that were kind of like even more like jokeful and playful, because I don't speak any of the languages of the Philippines, but there's definitely language related like puns and playfulness in this too, in English as well. But yeah, I'm definitely gonna read more of Gina Apostol's work for sure. And the last book I thought I would talk about, holding it upside down, that I haven't finished, but I did start in July, so I just thought I may as well talk a little bit about it. I'm a bit over halfway, was After Sappho by Sabi Wynn Schwartz. Yeah, like, I'm not enjoying it massively. Like, it sort of is supposedly my cup of tea because it's about, like, fin de siècle, queer women, writers, revolutionaries, that kind of thing, in mostly Europe. But, you know, it's fine so far. So, you know, it also does feel kind of like quite like a summery read to me for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why. But I have been enjoying learning a bit more about, like, Italy and, like, the context of, like, Italy in the 19th century, which I feel like I didn't really know. I also did get a book at the library for my, like, PhD recently, and I opened it up and then there was, like, a person, because it was about, like, political women and the issues they faced in Europe from 1880 to 19 whatever, and somebody who I only learned about through this, there we go, I found her, Anna Kuleskiev, I'm not sure how you pronounce her name. Yeah, so she's mentioned in this and I hadn't ever heard of her, and then, like, I opened that book and she was there and I was like, ah! Anyway, yeah, so, like, it's sort of also quite easy to read and enjoyable, but it's not, like, shatteringly great. But yeah, if you read any of these, please do let me know. And if you, yeah, or like if you want to read any of them, let me know. Just love to hear your thoughts. And if you have any recommendations for books that are like interactive, definitely let me know. And yeah, I will talk to you when I expect to. Bye!